This week we start out with Linda Moulton Howe in Glen Rose, Texas, near Stephenville, Texas, where that incredible sequence of UFO sightings took place a week ago. She has with her Steve Allen, the pilot who first observed this craft, a pilot of 30 years, who is going to tell us his own personal story of what he saw. Were these Air Force jets? Was it a secret weapon? Or was this genuinely something from somewhere else, where our Emmy Award-winning reporter is an Emmy Award winner for a reason? She's on the scene in cases like this, and she has got for us a blockbuster of a report. Then later, we're going to be talking to Don Schmidt. Don Schmidt is the leading expert on Roswell. He has some extraordinary new revelations, and the Air Force was doing the same thing back then that they are doing right now, saying, oh, it was just one of ours. Now, here she is from Texas, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. I have just spent the most extraordinary time here, arriving in the late evening of Tuesday, January 29th, and spending the 30th and the 31st seeing extraordinary videotapes, interviewing eyewitnesses, and going with Ricky Sorrells into those woods where he went deer hunting on New Year's Day, January 1st, and had an object fill the sky above him that from his machinist's point of view looked like a molded matte gray metal with a very strict and straight grid of embedded cone-shaped holes. And we walked through the area that he walked off, and then I could see with my own eyes why he says it was at least 1,000 feet long, or 3 football fields long. I have seen it for myself. I understand it. And when you're standing there realizing that the sky 300 feet above was completely obliterated by this metallic object, that when it moved, it was there and then it was gone, without inertia, without sound, without any kind of air of any kind. And I have also interviewed the constable in Dublin. And this is a story that I will be fleshing out next week on Dreamland and EarthFiles.com in depth, and it involves 3 police officers who saw not only a gigantic object in the sky, one of them has done a drawing, and he also saw holes in the bottom of the strangest, almost like a flying rectangular wing. There's no other way to describe it. I also have seen videotape of a beam of light coming down on a small hill above deer feeders in a place called Brownwood. It's in the general region, but probably 44 miles away from Dublin and another 55 or 60 miles from Stephenville, but still in the general area. And in that video, not only do you see a beam of light in November, in December, a deer steps into the beam of light and disappears, and in January, what shows up, lasting for 6 hours, is the most vivid sphere of what appears to be a plasma that I've ever seen, as if it were focused around or studying the deer cameras in the very areas where the deer had disappeared and where this beam of light had come. Then the next issue is, what could there be any relationship between what so many people saw on the evening of January 8th, 2008, with what Ricky Sorrell saw over that woods, and what other people have new videotape of extraordinary, almost look like pulsing hieroglyphs in the sky around January 19th to the 20th. I will be going into all of this potpourri over the next week or two at Earth Files Dreamland. But tonight, we have it's absolutely amazing, one of the most amazing of the stories of an eyewitness, in which Steve Allen, the owner of L&S Enterprises, started in 1994 with his wife, Lakita. At They have had this very successful transportation trucking company. Since then, he has flown over the last 30 years. He still flies twice a week for pleasure. And he is based in Glen Rose, but on the night of January 8, 2008 in Selden, which is about 25 miles from Stephenville, he and a couple of colleagues had decided they would go up on a hill and relax, watch the sun go down. And now it is 6:12 p.m., January 8, 2008. And here now from one of three eyewitnesses is Steve Allen.
Yes, about 6:12 in the afternoon, we was at the top of a hill, a little campfire going. I looked off to the east. We saw some bright lights coming at us at a very, very high rate of speed. Looked to be about 2,500 to 3,000 foot above ground level. These lights was white, very, very bright, intense, kind of like a magnesium torch burning or something. I asked the gentleman with me if they could see what I was seeing, and everybody concurred. As the craft approached us, it was totally silent outside. We couldn't hear anything. There was no noise, like an aircraft or anything. It was gradually slowing down. By the time it got even with us, it was probably only running around the 200 or 300 mile an hour mark. The lights seemed to be about a half a mile apart in the front, and the lights in the rear was about a mile back. As the whatever it was basically invisible. We had plenty of sunlight outside, unlimited visibility, no clouds or anything. The sun was just setting. It still was about halfway up, so we had great visibility, could see everything. The lights was not attached to anything. Whatever it was, all the lights seemed to be moving parallel in unison with each other, the same altitude, the same speed, keeping their distance exactly with each other. As the craft passed us, there appeared more lights in the back. We could see two original lights, but now there was like 7 lights in the back, equally spaced. These lights was blinking, not with any rhyme or reason. It's like your turn indicator of your car. They would flash and on, and then intermittently another one with no specific time sequence on them. As the craft or whatever it was got towards Stephenville, over it, towards the west of us, it was about 3 miles away at this point. It seemed to have just came to a complete stop, and it was still at the same altitude. The lights in the rear reconfigured to a arch, upward type arch, still very bright and flashing. And then 2 or 3 seconds later, all the lights arranged themselves to a vertical scenario, and they were still flashing with no rhyme or reason in what particular segment or anything. Then about 2 seconds later, there became 2 sets of these lights with the vertical scenario. And then 2 or 3 more seconds, they burst into a flame. I can't describe how bright the flame was. It was like a white-colored flame, approximately 50 yards wide and 150 yards tall. It's very amazing. It was practically unbelievable. All of us was discussing what we were seeing as it happened, just almost in non-belief. Of course, it was within very close range. It was not a reflection or anything. We knew what we were seeing. And then after the flame, about 2 or 3 seconds later, it just all simply disappeared.
There's more to come, but here I think it's important to get a word picture that think of 2 rectangles in the sky, and Steve and I have talked about this, that it was a solid, like a rectangle with straight edges, but inside it would be like roaring flames, but instead of the yellow, reddish flames that we see in a fire, these distinct roiling flames were like what he called a dirty white. And tell our audience what went through your mind and your colleague Mike Odom and Lance Jones as you're discussing 2 gigantic rectangles of roaring white flame in the sky after the configurations of lights changing.
It was simply amazing. Several things came to our mind as to what it was. We was to the point we was almost afraid. not scared to death, but quite concerned of what was going on and trying to figure out what it was. We thought it might have been a biblical moment or something. That's what it seemed to me like, is something out of the Bible, where you read in Genesis of flames and angels in the sky and things like that. It's the only reasonable explanation we could come to. And then it disappeared. And one gentleman, it shook him up so bad he got in his car and just left. He didn't say anything to us or anything. He simply drove away, and that was Lance Jones. He's works for the government as a mail carrier. He's quite a good gentleman. We went inside the house and told Mike's wife about it, and she says, I'm going to call Lance. And she called Lance, and Lance says, y'all hurry up and get back outside. It's coming back. And so we ran outside, and that's when we saw it coming from the west at a relatively high rate of speed. By now it's quite dark. The sun had gone down, and as it came past us this time, it was a little lower and to the south of us this time, whereas originally it was to the north of us. It came past. We could hear some jets roaring this time. It had been totally silent, and as it came by, it was silent, but we could hear jets in the background. And we counted about 4 seconds, and that's when we saw the 2 military F-16 jets come by in hot pursuit.
And at this time, there are the 2 very, very bright white lights in the front, correct? And in the back, where there were the 2 white lights forming that mile-long by half-mile-long rectangle, you now are seeing red half-moons that are glowing, in which those back 2 white lights are embedded?
Yes, the back 2 white lights was directly in the center of these 2 red glowing, I don't know if you would call them orbs or what. They was protruding out the back. Very large, very bright red that I've never witnessed that color of red, and that's one of my favorite colors. Just never seen a color that vivid, or I don't know if it was heat or what. And that's when, of course, like I said, the jets was behind it. They was at the same altitude, had the same heading. They was definitely in pursuit, because when they came by us, they had their afterburners on, and I noticed the two jets had flame coming out the back of them, from their afterburner. And they was traveling east at a high rate of speed, but whatever the craft was, the UFO was definitely keeping them where they wanted it. It was kind of a cat and mouse game. Obviously, the jets was the mouse.
And you, from your pilot experience and background and knowing this area and knowing what the military jets do coming out of these various military installations, what was it that struck you about what these jets were doing with that afterburner blasting in an area of Selden?
Well, several things. We're not in a military operating area. It's called a MOA. We're quite some ways away from that area. We do see jets from time to time, but they're up at altitude. They're not at 1,500 or 2,000 foot above the ground. Plus, there was another thing that was a very good point, is how fast they was going. That's extremely fast to be at that low of an altitude and going that fast in this area. Just very unusual, very unusual. And the direction they came from, just basically out of anywhere or nowhere. There's not a military base for quite a few miles over there, so obviously they had it on radar from somewhere.
And what is your own personal comment on the military waiting in quite a few days after this event, when they at first said there was no activity in the Stephenville, Dublin, Glen Rose area, and then they said that they had 10 jets for 2 hours that were in some kind of exercise?
Well, I have several comments on that. It's a shame that they have a $200 million aircraft times 10, and they don't know where they're at or what they're doing. That's the best part of it all. If I had that many dollars worth of tied up, I'd know where it was at all times. I can tell you where my dog's at. They have GPSs on them. They know where they're at all given times. They wasn't in the military area. The second thing, I've seen the Blue Angels, Thunderbirds many, many times, been to many air shows. I've never seen 10 F-16s in the air at once. I didn't know that was even a possibility. Very unusual. It's hard to make 10 of them get in the air at once. They're fairly reliable, but they do, that's quite a bit of inventory to have for the military in the air at once.
And Whitley, I have talked with another eyewitness in the Dublin area back around the January 8th period. And this person said that a jet came down so low over their residential area in this very remote rural area. Dublin is really out there. That the jet came down so low it rattled the windows. He thought the windows were going to break from the frame, and he ran out of his house. And in all of the years that he has lived in Dublin, he has never experienced this before the January 8th, 2008 time period. And when you put all of this together with all of the videotapes and drawings that I have been seeing here and the interviews that I have done with people who are in authority in these cities, even some who are afraid yet to speak on the record, the answer to those questions that you posed at the beginning of Dreamland is, no, it's not military. No, it was not a normal operation. And it was not confined to January 8th. It went on from January 1, and the most recent videotapes, Whitley, have been done January 19th to the 20th. One is absolutely extraordinary in terms of looking like pulsing human abductee symbols. They look like symbols in the sky, and I will be doing a further report on Dreamland and at Earth Files about this. And the question that people are beginning to ask is, whatever is in these craft, are they trying to communicate with civilians? Are they trying to communicate with the military? Is communication involved? Why is it going on over a period of 3 weeks in extraordinary ways and involving people who have never, ever seen anything like this before in their lives?
Linda, let me ask you a little bit more. You have seen these symbols on videotape now with your own eyes?
Absolutely.
What exactly, can you describe them?
I have seen every pattern that was clear in the sky in the writings of the human abductee symbols. And when
you say that, what do you mean?
Okay.
Writings of which abductees?
Remember Mario Pazzaglini, the psychologist in Delaware who was assembling all of the symbols from human abductee cases?
Right.
And he gave me a package of about 500 pages. And I have studied it, and I have worked with Jim Sparks and so many other abductees over the years, and I have seen the symbols that they have remembered in various varieties of whether it was on a wall or whether it was something they found themselves writing at a desk. And when you see these symbols, this was immediately what came to my mind. I have seen these in these, let's call it the symbol language in the human abduction syndrome.
Well, that's utterly fantastic.
Yes.
Linda, that's perhaps the most fantastic UFO sighting ever.
Well, I'm telling you, not only has it been going on since New Year's Day, if you had seen the videotapes that hopefully at some point I am going to be able to share publicly of what happened in December and November, where, again, deer hunting, infrared cameras that captured this extraordinary deer disappearing in a beam of light. Are they related? I don't know. Have people in the human abduction syndrome and ranchers described for going back into the early 70s, ranchers were saying that they saw beams of light coming down in the same pastures where they had mutilated animals. In this case, the deer is not left mutilated. The deer steps into an area where a beam had been the month before and disappears. And I have been there. I have been to the cameras. I have photographed. Everything is exactly in order, and the people are as baffled as I am. And when I said, how in the world could there be some sort of a residue or a delay, or what are we missing, that in 1 month it is very clear, Whitley, I'm not talking about subtle. This beam comes, it looks like something out of Star Trek. These people are very, very innocent, wonderful people who run their own private house, and they have property, sort of like Ricky Sorrells has those backwoods, and they put up these deer cameras to watch the animals, and every once in a while they will go after a deer. That's it. It's just a simple family. And they were so baffled by the fact that they had the beam in November, and then in December, it was about 14 days later, they have the deer at the feeder, and one of them, the right leg goes forward, and if you overlaid the beam and the deer where the leg goes forward, the deer disappears in the spot, but you don't see the beam in December.
Oh my goodness! It's like something out of the movies. It's
and there's a
even
lot.
Stranger.
Yes, and let me say right now that I can speak on first-hand testimony from people who have talked to me. There have been strict and serious calls from people who seem to be implying that they have either military sanction or are calling on behalf of the military to say to people like the constable, Leroy Gatelin, look, we're trying to make it clear to you, this is only military terrestrial equipment in the sky. And when the constable, who's been a police officer for 17 years, was chief of police and is now constable in Dublin, says, what I saw and my son saw and the police officers that I've talked to, what we saw, we're talking about, and he said, at least 3 football fields, and he said to the military people, I can pretty much say with confidence that what we are seeing here is not military aircraft. And he said this to me in an interview that I'll be able to share next week on Dreamland and Earth Files. And he himself, as somebody in law enforcement, speaking on the record, says, I wish I could say this is American military. But Linda, you can't explain something a mile long, completely silent, that's only a few hundred feet above the ground.
Nor can you explain those symbols.
No.
Nor a light that causes deer to go up in the sky. Obviously, if this is American military, our military is out of control. I mean, they've got mad scientists or something working there. And
the bottom line is that that's not the answer, as far as I can tell as a reporter. High strangeness has been afoot here now since at least New Year's Day. And my question as an investigative reporter is, what might our military and our government be doing in underground military operations that has brought the attention of the non-human intelligence that we know interacts with our planet?
Linda, that is a great and ageless question, not just for today, but for a long time to come. And I'm sure if there's anyone on this planet who's going to manage to get some kind of an answer to it, I'm talking to her right now. Linda Moulton Howe, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank Steve Allen as well for a truly extraordinary listening experience. Now we're going to go back in time to 1947 for another extraordinary listening experience where the author of Alien Agenda, arguably one of the great experts on this whole cover-up, and Don Schmitt, arguably one of the great experts on Roswell, talk together about where the secrecy started and why. We'll be right back.
Howdy. This is Jim Mars. We're here today on Dreamland with a very exciting guest, Donald R. Schmitt, one of the co-authors of a new book, Witness to Roswell. And, of course, those of you who are aware and awake know that Don Schmitt has been involved in the Roswell story now for a long time and has done groundbreaking work. Don, thank you so much for being with us today, and let me be the first to congratulate you on this absolutely amazing book, Witness to Roswell, Unmasking the 60-Year Cover-Up. Obviously,
so much,
Roswell has been a pet project of yours Do you feel now that you are at the end of the road, or do you think there's still ground to be plowed?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, even with the release of the book this past June, there isn't a day that goes by that we are not tracking down additional witnesses, following up on old leads. It's amazing how many leads that we even received maybe 10 years ago that now all of a sudden have fallen into place and make sense as part of this, big puzzle. And we try to, piece, this old information in. Sadly, as well, we're getting more and more deathbed testimony as evidence with the book.
Yeah,
and
time
so
passes. Don, this is, as you know, I was for a time back in the 60s and 70s, a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, home to Carswell Air Force Base, which at that time was the head of the Strategic Air Command headquarters.
That's correct.
The thing that got me, and I will just share this with you, and unfortunately I could kick myself because I don't have any dates, names, and places, but
I remember threatening to kick you myself one time when you didn't have the names. So.
I know, but what happened was that over the course of my career working for the Star-Telegram, I came into contact with, of course, a lot of people out there. In fact, at one time I was the aerospace military writer, but I would go out on other stories. And then, after I got that story and was worrying about meeting a deadline or whatever, I would meet these people and they'd say, I was here in 1947. And I said, well, did you hear anything about spaceships and bodies? And they went, oh, yeah. And they would talk about, I remember one fellow said he roomed with a air policeman, and that the policeman told him he had guarded this hangar where they had these bodies.
At Fort Worth.
At Fort Worth.
And that's amazing because the government would have us believe that Fort Worth was merely, the location of the infamous weather balloon press conference.
Right.
With General Ramey. But the very thought that even the rumors and the talk about bodies, at Fort Worth, to me, is just quite amazing. It really, again, it speaks of just the level of, security, the level of secrecy, just going up the entire chain of command.
Exactly. It was like the old pea in the pod trick. You just shuffle things around enough to where people lose sight of it.
Right. And they did.
Yes.
Sadly.
And let me tell you why I'm so impressed with your book, Witness to Roswell, is because as a longtime reporter, researcher, I have come to the realization that documents can be phonied. Evidence can be planted, but when you have people's testimony, and yes, people can lie, but only individually.
Yes.
It's very difficult for a whole wide range of people, some of whom have never even been in contact with each other, to all concoct a lie that is internally consistent. I think I take it from the subject of your new book that you too are impressed with human testimony.
Very much so. In fact, even to the chagrin of some of our colleagues who tried to dispel any notion on our part to even continue tracking down any further eyewitness testimony. We've been told over and over again, we have to find documentation. But just as you say, Jim, we've seen too many examples of where documents have been, falsified, have been fabricated. When you consider that eyewitness testimony is more times than not, enough to put someone on death row. When you think of all the times that people have been sentenced to lifetime, incarceration for nothing more than I say I saw you do that.
You're absolutely right. If I was on trial for murder and you stood up and said I saw him do it, man, I'd be gone.
Yes, absolutely. And as you also mentioned, and even by you're describing as far as even the talk at Fort Worth, that is the one thing that has impressed me, I think, the most about the entire Roswell investigation. We're not just talking about Roswell. We're not just talking about the ranchers, the lay people, the civilians involved. We're not just talking about the press around Roswell at that time, but we're also certainly talking about the military, and we're talking about the 509th Atomic Bomb Squadron, which was, at that time, considered about the elite in the military in 1947.
Oh, they were the first string. They were the top of the heap. These guys had their hands on the atomic secrets.
Absolutely, and the very notion, the very thought that the government is still asking us after 60 years to believe that all of these people were so incompetent, were just so deluded that they couldn't even recognize something as mundane as a very common weather device. I don't care if you're talking Project Mogul or anything else top secret. When it's on the ground in front of you and you can handle it, it's still a weather balloon.
That's right. That's exactly right. But and again, as we've been saying, evidence and hard is what we like to think of as the hard evidence. Okay, the smoking gun, the fingerprint,
the Holy Grail,
the documents. Yeah, all that can be fabricated quite easily.
And then, just for this, in the same token, as we mentioned earlier, that now we're getting more and more deathbed testimony. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the book just on such, confessions. These are admissible in a court of law. They are accepted as physical evidence. The very idea that someone would lie to their spouse, lie to their immediate loved ones, within days of their passing about something, this extraordinary. And the point is, they're all lying about the same thing, if we're to believe that. They're all talking about the little people, about the little men, about the bodies. And as one of the officers said to us, they sure weren't from Texas.
That's for sure. Well, so you can't really trust the hard evidence in all cases, so we're left with circumstantial evidence, which we've always kind of been taught as, well, that's not really the best. But, Don, as a reporter over the years, I've found that sometimes the circumstantial evidence may actually be the best because you cannot change the circumstances.
That's
and
correct.
What I'm talking about specifically here is that, and I don't know if you've taken note of this, I'm sure you probably have, but Colonel Blanchard, who was the base commander there at Roswell and who authorized the press release, the first one that said, we've captured a flying saucer. Okay, now, any way you want to look at this, he screwed up, okay? Either it was a flying saucer, in which case, wow, they didn't want that out, or it was not. It was a mogul balloon, which is top secret, and he made a mistake there. In other words, he really kind of messed up. So, having been in the military myself, I can assure you that in the military, the way to advancement is not to mess up. And if you mess up, then chances are, you just get pushed off and over, and that's the end of it. And yet Colonel Blanchard went on to become one of the youngest brigadier generals in military history.
And also went on to become a 4-star general.
Exactly. Which tells me he didn't screw up. When he said it was a flying saucer, that wasn't a screw up. And when he said, I misspoke, it was something else, he didn't screw up there either. He was following orders.
Of the master plan. In fact, it was quite ingenious. It was the typical creation of a straw man. First you build it up, and then you tear it down. It had already leaked out to the press to the point that they couldn't deny anything being recovered. Right. So they went with their first inclination, which was, most people just aren't even going to believe this. We claim this is a flying saucer. We got them already running for the hills. But the main point is, Jim, when rancher Mac Brazel first brought the material in to the sheriff of Chavez County, George Wilcox, on Sunday, July 6th, there was a whole box of the material already turned over to the military. Because when Blanchard dispatched his 2 head of intelligence, now just imagine, if you have something that you can't recognize, you can't identify, and the very fact that you just don't send out a couple grunts, a couple, GIs, a couple MPs, just go check it out, see what it is. No, you said the head of both departments of your intelligence, one being Major Jesse Marcel, and then the counterintelligence officer, Captain Sheridan Cabot, in case it's something foreign. That's the whole point. Nobody could identify this stuff. But again, the main point is, they had the material in hand on Sunday, July 6th. They don't put the press release out for 2 more days. So for the skeptics to continue to suggest that this was just an overreaction, this knee-jerk response on the part of the military, well, they had 2 days to think about it.
That's absolutely correct.
And Washington was completely in on it. That's the other point.
So are you saying that the release of the statement that we've captured a flying saucer
Came from Washington.
Came from Washington.
Came from Washington, yes.
Well, the thing that strikes me is, of course, is that one of the arguments I've heard, which makes absolutely no sense to me, is that they put out the story of a flying saucer because they did not want Soviet agents rushing to New Mexico, which to me is just, that's a non sequitur. If you don't want them rushing to New Mexico to look for a mogul balloon, why in the hell would you say it was a flying saucer when they really rushed for that?
The wording of the press release was actually quite ingenious. It doesn't mention any names except Major Marcel. And he is dispatched, he's sent to Fort Worth to meet with General Ramey for the press conference. And Colonel Blanchard conveniently goes on leave. He announces he's going to Hawaii on vacation on a 4th of July weekend after the weekend, on Tuesday, after the 4th of July weekend, when he could have taken the whole weekend. And
well, he's had a good 4th of July, now it's time for vacation.
So, I mean, this idea that, everybody, just overreacted. And this diversion, as you describe it, there were more Soviet spies in New Mexico at that time, just because they had the bomb there.
Well, they had everything there.
They had everything.
They
had
the German Sandia and Los Alamos. And,
the rocket launchings of the V-2 German rockets.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, New Mexico was probably the most sensitive region of the country at that time. And you're absolutely correct. And even in the wording of the press release, it says that they had recovered the disc. They had it.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing left out there. And yet, as all descriptions would attest to, there was still a whole debris field.
Right, and yet they brought something back that I remember in your book was described as about the size of a Volkswagen.
Well, that's what was discovered. That's what was recovered.
That was what was on the low boy.
North of town, correct. That was at a separate location.
Well, let's see if we can figure out what was under that tarp and that was the size of a Volkswagen when we come back right after this break. Howdy, I'm Jim Mars. We're back here on Dreamland with Donald Smith. Don, what do you think was under the tarp on the lowboy that was brought back into the Roswell Army Airfield Base?
Well, one of the things that was always a strong curiosity was the fact that why would the sheriff's department, as well as the fire department in Roswell, now both are within the county seat of Chavez County, the southeastern part of New Mexico, whereas the debris field, the rancher reporting the find of this, crash, is from another county. So in other words, one county obviously doesn't have jurisdiction, has no right going in to do anything
right
in another county. So it suggested that there was something else also much closer to town. And we kept hearing this magic number of 40 miles north of Roswell. And the more we, continued the investigation, we started to get closer and closer to the idea, and then finally to the actual first-hand testimony that the remainder of the ship, an actual capsule or a pod, almost like an escape capsule of sort, part of the original ship, had continued on for another 30-some miles before impacting about 40 miles north of Roswell. And this is where they would also discover the remains of the crew.
Right. That's where the bodies were discovered.
The bodies, correct. And then for all the description that trucks were going back and forth, and then finally that there was an ambulance truck that went out through the front gate, went out north of town, and then there was one crucial MP who was part of the cordon on the highway north of town. And his coming into the museum in Roswell one day and commenting, not having seen anything, but the talk was that whatever it was, if it would have stayed in the air just a few seconds longer, it would have crashed right in the middle of the highway. So that, too, gave us a point of reference. So, again, it all suggested that something else was recovered just north of town.
So when we talk about the crash at Roswell, we may actually be talking about 2 or even 3 separate events.
Or locations or
locations
involved with the event itself, correct.
Right.
So,
let me tell you this little anecdote that you can add to your inventory. Unfortunately, I tried to find the clipping and it's lost in the piles. But in 1997, when they had the first big 50-year anniversary of the crash there at Roswell, there was a story in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and it only ran locally, about a couple who at that time were living in Weatherford, Texas, which is just west of Fort Worth. And they contacted the paper, and the wife said that she had been at home in the kitchen, I think clearing dishes or something like that, and she saw this bright light, heard this tremendous noise, looked out and saw this flaming thing go whizzing overhead and flying off, and then she was so excited about that, and she couldn't wait to tell her husband, who was an airman at the Roswell Air Base. She said, but when he got home, she couldn't even tell him her story because he was too excited telling her about how they'd locked down the base and that how the rumor was is that this spaceship had crashed and that there were these bodies on board. So, you know, it just adds to the immense amount of eyewitness testimony and people at the time. But, of course, all that went doggo real soon after the military announced that it was just a weather balloon. So, Don, why don't you address the issue about why did people not say more at the time?
Well, certainly back in 1947, the military was God. Coming off of World War II, I mean, the country was just reaching a crescendo of euphoria, of optimism for the future. You know, the military
was in charge.
The military was in charge.
And if you remember the science fiction movies of the 50s and even into the 60s, no matter what happened, the first thing was call the Army.
Call the Army, and the Army to the rescue. And no matter what the threat, you know, the military would always save us. And as a result, certainly when they acknowledged, you know, or I should say retracted the flying saucer explanation, and then provided the weather balloon, you know, story. That certainly was accepted. That was and generally accepted by the press at that time. Even General Ramey, when we interviewed his chief of staff, Brigadier General Thomas DuBose, and DuBose, who even signed an affidavit describing how he was one of the guys who helped to substitute the weather balloon for the actual material.
Right.
And yet after they allowed the press, specifically James Bond Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, to take about 5 of the actual pictures that went out on the wire service, according to DuBose, that Ramey looked at him and said, I don't want to ever hear you bring this up again. And
in other words, end of story.
End of story. And that's precisely what Marcel was told before he flew back to Roswell after that press conference.
That's right.
And in fact, when he returned home, when you think back to, on his way back to the base with the first load of actual wreckage, and it's about 2 a.m, and he wakes his son, Jess Jr., and his wife, Vi, and take them down into the kitchen where he has actual debris scattered.
Right.
So that's where Jess Jr. still describes handling the I-beam, seeing the symbology on this strip of material.
You know, some years ago I had a conversation with Bond Johnson, and as I recall, he said that he was originally called out to Carswell, went into Ramey's office, and General Ramey then told him to get out. He got out. A few minutes later, they called him back in, and then here was this debris. And he was very, very much under the impression that they had substituted whatever had been there originally for this balloon debris.
Yes, in fact, all of our interviews with Johnson as well. In fact, he even described how one of the first things he noticed was the rank smell of rotting rubber, neoprene rubber, right outside the office, and he just couldn't believe that the general would even allow, that garbage.
Yeah, why bring that garbage
strewn across
involved?
the floor of his own office?
Right.
Because that's all it was just the remains of a weather balloon.
Well, at this late date, how close do you feel like that we are to achieving a true picture of what happened at Roswell?
We've had now 3 archaeological digs at the debris field site, the Brazel Ranch site. And the last time was with subterranean radar. That was last year. We are making plans to go back again next year and actually expand the project. The prevailing winds through that region, one of the ongoing jokes between us is we might be better off looking in western Texas. Because
not a bad idea.
May have been scattered for miles before they were able to retrieve all of it. But we've always heard from other, ranchers and hired hands through the years how they managed to recover a piece or two after the military cleanup. So they weren't perfect. They weren't, just completely,
100%. Well, that I have to ask you, with your ground-penetrating radar, and I'm sure you've had metal detectors,
yes.
Have you found any piece of wreckage or something that you feel like it might be?
We've had a couple of interesting pieces of material that the University of New Mexico is still working on, just that they do not appear to be indigenous to that site. That one, for example, as an aside even, is a rubber-lugged sole of a boot. And the ranchers all wear, leather-soled cowboy boots.
Right.
And our suspicion is that this may be an Army boot. And we're still waiting on some forensic analysis, because
I'm not sure what that would prove, other than some Army trooper had been in the area. But it isn't like you just drive up to this site. No.
It is on private property, and even to find it by today's account, you almost need to be driven into the site. It is high desert. It is in no way a tourist attraction. We've kept our word to the ranch owner, and the idea that even if some soldier had been out there at any time, highly unlikely. This would have been the one time that they certainly, were very prevalent throughout that ranch area.
Well, there was this story that there was some sort of a archaeological or scientific team that happened to be in the area and stumble across this thing. Have you been able to either verify that or disprove that?
Well, getting back again to that site about 40 miles north of town, there was a group from Western Tech who was out there under the directorship of Professor William Curry Holden. And Holden, before he died, did confirm they were there. As he put it, we saw everything, but that's as far as he would go. That they were sworn to secrecy, and they were warned never to say another word about it. There was also another archaeologist by the name of Bertram Schultz, who was working the Guadalupe Mountains at that time, and he was actually meeting with Holden in Roswell to then drive and attend a conference on that weekend. And Schultz was staying at the Nixon Hotel in Roswell, expecting to meet with Holden, and he didn't show up till later in the evening because he had been detained at the base all afternoon over some situation, but wouldn't go into it. We've had some anonymous sources, people who describe either being out there or being aware of the team that was working that general area. One of the things that also is a curiosity is the El Paso natural gas line runs through that area, diagonally through that region. and they were already surveying and attempting some initial excavation. And one of the reasons we believe they may not have been archaeologists, but rather geologists, who were actually more rock hunters, that type of thing, and typically would come in with some new excavation, underway. And almost, I use it with all due respect, almost like scavengers, where the excavation makes it easy for them. They just go in after the fact and, check over as far as the newly, turned up soil.
Right. Well, when we come back, let's talk about how warnings went so far as to include death threats.
Very good.
Which shows that something really serious was going on. We'll be right back after this. Well, we're back here on Dreamland. This is your host, Jim Mars. Today we're talking to Donald Smith about his new book, Witness to Roswell. And we've been talking about a lot of the things surrounding the mystery of what crashed in Roswell in 1947. Don, you mentioned that all these people were warned not to talk. Warnings are one thing. I'm reminded of a story that took place during World War II when the Japanese were sending firebombs over by balloon and drifting them across the Pacific.
The Fugo balloon bombs, yes.
Yes, and in the hopes apparently of setting fires and on the West Coast. We can see today how effective that could have been. And I recall that one of them actually made it almost into the Midwest, and a local newspaper reporter, a woman, found out about this story and was preparing a story when the FBI came to her and said, look, if you run this story, it could give lots of critical information to the Japanese, who are our enemy, and we really would wish that you wouldn't run this story. And being a good patriotic American, the reporter complied and did not run that story until after the end of the war. Now, to me, that's the way that any responsible democratic government should handle a security situation. And yet, we find in Roswell there were people, including teenagers and basically young kids, who were threatened with their lives. Have you been able to confirm that? And if so, what could be so important about a mogul balloon that would require them to threaten U.S. citizens?
Well, first of all, if the materials were that sensitive, which they weren't, the project mogul balloon situation, it was the project itself that was classified top secret, not the materials.
Right.
And then the claim also that, well, it was missing launch number 4, then they changed it to number 9. You take your pick. But the point is, if it was a missing launch, then what in God's name was displayed in General Ramey's office? And
missing.
Then on top of it, they allow the press to photograph it and splash it all over the newspapers.
Right.
So much for this being such a, top secret. Well,
Carl Flock at one point wrote a whole book trying to argue that it was simply the mogul balloon, and yet if you read his book carefully, you find that there were, I believe, like 22 mogul balloon launches, and they only recovered less than 10 of them. And Carl Flock, in his book, admits the reason they didn't recover more is because they didn't bother to go look for it.
They didn't bother to go look for it because, again,
so
the
much
materials...
for this big top-secret classified program.
Exactly. And the way they not only had military personnel, take an oath, swear an oath of secrecy that they would never discuss this matter again, the way they would take them into separate rooms and, collectively, you are never to say another word about this. Special flights that came in and out of the base, and they were instructed that this is a non-flight. This is a non-scheduled flight. You're not to mention anything about this flight. But it's one thing when you give orders to the military, because it's just that simple.
Right.
You're not to ever say anything about this. End of story. Just as Ramey telling DuBose, I don't want to hear you bring this up again.
They would tell you that. I heard that in the military just over a mistyped report. Don't mention this.
No, because of the embarrassment.
Right.
But this was something, again, much bigger because they were also adding "or else," and to the point that military officers, even beyond the 25-year limit as far as a statute of limitation, as far as security oaths, even non-disclosure statements when one leaves the service, that type of thing, that even after the Project Vogel report came out, and the Secretary of the Air Force, Sharon Windall, actually released all Air Force personnel of their security oaths regarding Roswell. And to us, we always took that as a bit of a red herring because, well, they were releasing all Air Force personnel. Well, there was no Air Force in July of 1947.
Right.
This was an Army incident. But nonetheless, even when we would approach a witness, albeit reluctant witness, and, provide them with a copy of that release, they would still invariably say, "I'm sorry, I don't care. I'm still sworn to secrecy. I still can't talk about this." Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, who was in charge of all military security, he wouldn't even admit he was out at the site. "I'm sworn to secrecy."
It sounds like that there were separate secrecy oaths taken.
Yes. I think it was one type for the general officers, and then another one for the non-commissioned officers. But
go ahead.
But what do you do with the civilians involved? I mean, you have ranchers, you have reporters, you have children who have handled pieces of the wreckage, who have heard things, have seen things that they shouldn't have. And when we have description after the description of the military arriving at their homes and sequestering the parents in one room and the children in another, and I don't care if we're talking about the sheriff, George Wilcox, or we're talking about one of the firemen, Dan Dwyer, or if we're talking about the majority owner of radio station KGFL, Walt Whitmore Sr., or his reporters, Frank Joyce or Judd Roberts, or the Brazel family themselves. They all describe being told, not only are you never to say another word about this, but if you ever do, we're going to kill you, or we're going to kill your children, or, we'll take you out into the desert, and it's a long way back, or the children, you'll never see your parents again, that type of thing. We're not talking about just one lone example of such, extreme scare tactics, but just a growing number of civilian testimony, and even here now 60 years later, when they describe such, just outlandish measures on the part of our government in containing, information about the recovery of a weather balloon, these people still become very emotional. They even break down.
Right.
Suggesting that it's still something that they're haunted by, that they just have never gotten over the fact, not what they saw, not what they might have handled, but the very idea that our vanguards, our protectors at the gate, the very people that we trust, the greatest here in this country, totally betrayed that, that position in their eyes, and
right.
just, laid down the ultimate sanction. We're going to kill you if you ever talk about this.
Incredible. I've often wondered if the fact that in September of 1947, just a few months after Roswell, President Truman signed into law the National Security Act of 1947.
Yes.
One of its provisions was to separate the Air Force from the Army and
Precisely.
create a separate branch of service. And, of
Right.
course, from that point on, all the way through the 50s, 60s, 70s, we were told that the Air Force was in charge of the UFO issue. And yet, since they were only created months after Roswell, then I could see that they could legitimately and honestly say they had no information because they probably didn't.
And you just can't imagine a new branch of the military coming up to speed that quickly on something that they did not have first-hand control over. And are we to believe also that the Army just would have relinquished, everything they had right in their own hands
Right.
to another
know
branch
anything
at that
about
time.
the rivalry between the Navy, the Army, the Air Force?
Oh, yes.
You realize that that was the reason that the Central Intelligence Agency was formed, was to try to correlate that information, because the military services would keep things from each other.
Yes, they were all in competition with one another.
Right. It's an amazing story, and the amount of witnesses that you've collected, and you and your co-author Thomas Carey,
Tom Carey, yeah,
in Witness to Roswell, I think is just a tremendous personal testimony to what actually went on. In fact, the way I view Roswell today is it's simply who you choose to believe. You can believe, right. You can believe the government, which has presented us with 4 separate accounts of what happened with little or nothing to back it up, or you can choose to trust the, I don't know, what would you say, Don, 400 perhaps? As many as 400 witnesses on the record now?
We've actually spoken to over 600.
600
people.
Individuals who say that it was something other than a mogul balloon or a weather balloon.
So far, the mogul balloonists are batting 0. No witnesses.
Right. We'll continue this fascinating discussion right after these messages. Howdy, this is Jim Mars, and we're back here on Dreamland today with Donald Schmitt, who is a co-author of the new book, Witness to Roswell. And, of course, those of you with some memory would recall that actually it was Don Schmitt who helped to break the story of Roswell open in the first place. Don, where do you think you are today as opposed to your first book on Roswell?
Well, we know where the debris field precisely was located, and then that's the reason we've had the 3 archaeological digs. We believe we know exactly where the final impact site's located. We've been there. It matches exactly what the eyewitnesses have described to us. It's precisely on the ranch that witnesses have described. And in piecing it together in that sense, I mean, just the idea that there were multiple sites involved, it clearly rules out a weather balloon. And one of the things that also was, most significant with the second archaeological dig was that eyewitnesses described the gouge, that there was a furrow, suggesting that there was an impact, that something had actually skipped, had slammed into the ground, and then slid for a few hundred feet. And through the wind and rain erosion over the last 60 years, everything is filled in. Well, anyway, as part of that dig, we arranged for a backhoe, a shovel, to come in and to actually cross-dig through that precise location that eyewitnesses had taken us to and said, this is where we saw that furrow, that gouge. And one should know it that the shovel would jump as though it was hitting a pocket, as though it was hitting a softer sediment of ground. And when it was all pulled away, there it was, a symmetrical V. And the further down they went, it continued, a symmetrical V. And for the first time, it actually suggested, just our amazement that it was precisely where the witnesses said it was. But then, if this is ever confirmed, and that's another reason we want to go back, to finally establish once and for all, if indeed this is artificial, if it clearly suggests a point of impact, and then this would totally rule out any type of weather balloon device, because heaven knows a weather balloon does not create a gouge. No,
it would fly to pieces.
Precisely. And this has very little topsoil. It's high desert. It's mostly shale, slate, fieldstone. And as a result, there's nothing else ever documented, crashing on that particular parcel of land. So I think it would be a major blow against the mogulist. So that's something we're certainly looking forward to.
Right.
And certainly looking for the needle in the haystack as far as the piece of wreckage continues. We've had many false leads so far as people rumored to still possess a piece. But that doesn't mean that there isn't somebody still out there, and we'll continue, that search. And then certainly the remaining witnesses. The World War II generation, as you know, Jim, is dying off at a rate of about 1,500 per day.
Right.
And we feel it is totally incumbent on us to get to every last survivor and provide them with an opportunity to go on the record, to be part of the strength in numbers of people thus far, to date, who have been courageous enough to stand up and say, 4 explanations, no, the first one was the correct one, and I was there, and I saw it.
Right. It's absolutely amazing what went on, and of course today the skeptics would say, well, show me a piece of the craft. But yet, by all accounts, whatever it was taken into custody by the U.S. military and, of course, has never seen the light of day. Don, why do you suppose they felt the need for such secrecy over this?
Well, certainly back in the summer of 47, it is perfectly justified. As you had mentioned yourself earlier, Jim, about just the high concentration of Soviet spies in New Mexico. We had something in our hands that we couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't like your proverbial landing on the White House front lawn, take us to your leader type confrontation, where you at least get some answers. This provided none. We didn't know from where, from why, or from who. So all we could do is try to contain it, get a handle on it, attempt, some analysis, possible reverse engineering, if that has ever happened. And I am still one of those who is of the camp who believes that it still remains a cover-up of ignorance, that we still don't have any answers.
That they don't want to bring it up because they can't provide
They can't bring it because they have nothing to really tell us.
Well, and of course, one of the arguments that's been used is that they didn't want to panic the public. Now, today, with whole generations brought up on Star Wars and Star Trek and things like that, that doesn't seem to make much sense. But I'm sure you agree with me that in 1947, that was less than 10 years since Orson Welles' famous Halloween War of the Worlds broadcast. And of course, I think there's a great bit of difference between going on the public media and saying they've landed in New Jersey and they're burning cities and they're eating people,
exactly.
As opposed to simply saying something crashed here. But I can see the logic in that, but I do not see the logic in keeping it a secret today.
No.
Why do you think they're still keeping it a secret today? And do you think it may have to do with the revelations of advanced technology?
I think that is partly it, and I think it's still, as there would remain a continuing effort to duplicate the technology, if that is even possible. I think it's also political. I think there would be a lot of accountability, not only to acknowledge that they have been deceiving us for these past 60 years, but then the fact that they had actually threatened civilians in containing this.
Right.
And the very idea, the possibility that some of those threats were possibly carried out, as one officer kind of sheepishly admitted to us that maybe some of the accidents back then weren't really accidents. And whenever there's culpability, the government always heads for the high grass. And I just can't imagine a public official acknowledging any of this, but then adding, but vote for me, come next election.
Trust me.
But I think certainly one thing, as far as to our credit, the very notion that we couldn't handle this after now 60 years is really an insult, not only to our generation, but also the great generation from that time. Because there's no, accounts of panic, of mass suicide. The people who were there, they lived out their lives. They raised their families. They worked their jobs. They went to church. And they were involved. They saw it all firsthand. And they handled it. They went on. So I think that's such a misnomer to suggest that now after 60 years, well, we're not ready. Culture shock and, just the economic shock alone would be devastating to Wall Street. And, again, I think, it comes down to whose ox is being gored. And as you know, I typically, a politician is only in a perpetual campaign mode. The only person they're looking out for is themselves. And as a result, They typically do what is best for themselves, not us, not the public.
You can always tell if a politician's lying to you if his
lips are moving, right?
That's right.
I think that's one of the reasons that we are the ones that have to, continue to work to bring this all out.
Right.
I've given up on the idea that we're going to have any type of government disclosure. I think certainly with the now 4 explanations regarding Roswell, they're merely attempting to stall for time, run out the clock, and then the final witness is passed on, and it's, in their eyes, cover-up complete.
Right. Then
but
it just becomes urban legend.
Yes, and that's why they're using more and more that word myth. They're now, and as we describe in the book, we believe they're now official 5th explanation is just as you say, Jim, that they're now attempting to reduce this down to urban legend, that this is nothing more than just a myth.
Right. Which I think brings us to the absolute truth of Roswell, which is it boils down to your belief system. Who are you going to believe?
Your lying eyes?
Right, or your government.
Or your government.
Which has only been caught in lie after lie after lie.
And it's one of the things that even after now the 60th anniversary, for all the interviews with the press, and I always have to bring up, you distrust and you question the government about every other issue except this one.
That's right.
You accept this so blindly, and I throw it right back. Explain your reasoning, your rationality. And they don't have one, except that, well, I haven't really looked into it, is what they typically say. Well, you're the journalist, you're the investigator, go investigate.
Go investigate.
I think you'd be surprised what you'd really find.
And that brings up a real question in my mind. I can understand the military under orders. I can understand the politicians not wanting to stick their neck out. I can understand the plutocrats that run this country who want to keep their hands on secret advanced technology. But having worked in the news media my entire life, frankly, I don't have an answer, and I'd like to know, why do you think it is that the corporate mass media today steadfastly refuses to even investigate this issue?
I think it came down to a decision that was made early on, whether it was any type of oversight committee, people who were actually making a determination for what lied ahead back in 1947. And certainly the one group of people that they had to enlist from the get-go were the press.
Right.
I mean, the reporters, the press, the media would have been nipping at their ankles from then on. And I think that's why they made sure that they explained this away as quickly as they did. And it became a non-issue from then on. And I'm also convinced it's where the ridicule factor developed. And as a result, after all these years, all graduating journalists have been so indoctrinated, have been so programmed as to treat this subject as strictly taboo, that they all have this knee-jerk response. That, just as evidenced as far as recently with some of the presidential candidates, Stephen Kucinich, for example, Bill Richardson. You can't even mention UFOs without, people practically falling off their chairs.
Right. It's absolutely incredible. In my experience, I could tell you that I could be sitting at the same desk with another reporter, and somebody could run in and say a UFO landed down the street in the park, and the other reporter would just laugh and say, well, that guy's nuts. I guess I'm the odd one because I would at least get up and go look out the window.
And it's exactly the point, Jim. What if it's true? What if it's all true? And as any good reporter, any good investigator, you have to at least treat it as that indeed may be the case, because
absolutely. What if it is all true?
Right.
Well, I'm sorry, Don, we're out of time today. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I'm sure the listeners are going to really enjoy this one. Thank you so much for being with us here on Dreamland.
My pleasure, Jim. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
All right. This is Dreamland. This is Jim Mars. Adios.
Next week on Dreamland, Linda Howe will be back with more revelations from Texas. Plus, Dr. John Lerma will be with us. Dr. John Lerma is the doctor who took the implant, or attempted to take the implant, out of my ear in 1997. He has more to say about it, plus his incredible, beautiful new book, Into the Light. He
is 3,000 foot above ground level. These lights was white, very, very bright, intense, kind of like a magnesium torch burning or something. I asked the gentleman with me if they could see what I was seeing, and everybody concurred. As the craft approached us, it was totally silent outside. We couldn't hear anything. There was no noise, like an aircraft or anything. It was gradually slowing down. By the time it got even with us, it was probably only running around the 200 or 300 mile an hour mark. The lights seemed to be about a half a mile apart in the front, and the lights in the rear was about a mile back. As the whatever it was basically invisible. We had plenty of sunlight outside, unlimited visibility, no clouds or anything. The sun was just setting. It still was about halfway up. So we had great visibility, could see everything. The lights was not attached to anything. Whatever it was, all the lights seemed to be moving parallel in unison with each other, the same altitude, the same speed, keeping their distance exactly with each other. As the craft passed us, there appeared more lights in the back. We could see 2 original lights, but now there was like 7 lights in the back, equally spaced. These lights was blinking, not with any rhyme or reason. It's like your turn indicator of your car. They would flash and on, and then intermittently another one with no specific time sequence on them. As the craft or whatever it was got towards Stephenville, over it, towards the west of us, it was about 3 miles away at this point. It seemed to have just came to a complete stop, and it was still at the same altitude. The lights in the rear reconfigured to a arch, upward type arch, still very bright and flashing. And then 2 or 3 seconds later, all the lights arranged themselves to a vertical scenario, and they were still flashing with no rhyme or reason in what particular segment or anything. Then about 2 seconds later, there became 2 sets of these lights with the vertical scenario. And then 2 or 3 more seconds, they burst into a flame. I can't describe how bright the flame was. It was like a white-colored flame, approximately 50 yards wide and 150 yards tall. It's very amazing. It was practically unbelievable. All of us was discussing what we were seeing as it happened, just almost in non-belief. Of course, it was within very close range. It was not a reflection or anything. We knew what we were seeing. And then after the flame, about 2 or 3 seconds later, it just all simply disappeared.
There's more to come, but here I think it's important to get a word picture that these are, think of 2 rectangles in the sky, and Steve and I have talked about this, that it was a solid, like a rectangle with straight edges, but inside it would be like roaring flames, but instead of the yellow, reddish flames that we see in a fire, these distinct roiling flames were like what he called a dirty white. And tell our audience what went through your mind and your colleague Mike Odom and Lance Jones as you're discussing 2 gigantic rectangles of roaring white flame in the sky after the configurations of lights changing. in the very areas where the deer had disappeared and where this beam of light had come. Then the next issue is, what could there be any relationship between what so many people saw on the evening of January 8th, 2008, with what Ricky Sorrell saw over that woods, and what other people have new videotape of extraordinary, almost look like pulsing hieroglyphs in the sky around January 19th to the 20th. I will be going into all of this potpourri over the next week or two at Earth Files Dreamland, but tonight we have it's absolutely amazing, one of the most amazing of the stories of an eyewitness in which Steve Allen, the owner of L&S Enterprises, started in 1994 with his wife, Lakita. They have had this very successful transportation trucking company. Since then, he has flown over the last 30 years. He still flies twice a week for pleasure. And he is based in Glen Rose, but on the night of January 8, 2008 in Selden, which is about 25 miles from Stephenville, he and a couple of colleagues had decided they would go up on a hill and relax, watch the sun go down. And now it is 6:12 p.m., January 8, 2008. And here now from one of three eyewitnesses is Steve Allen.
Yes, about 6:12 in the afternoon, we was at the top of a hill, a little campfire going. I looked off to the east. We saw some bright lights coming at us at a very, very high rate of speed. Looked to be about 2,500.
Great grid of embedded cone-shaped holes, and we walked through the area that he walked off, and then I could see with my own eyes why he says it was at least 1,000 feet long, or 3 football fields long. I have seen it for myself. I understand it. And when you're standing there realizing that the sky 300 feet above was completely obliterated by this metallic object, that when it moved, it was there and then it was gone, without inertia, without sound, without any kind of air of any kind. And I have also interviewed the constable in Dublin. And this is a story that I will be fleshing out next week on Dreamland and EarthFiles.com in depth. And it involves 3 police officers who saw not only a gigantic object in the sky, one of them has done a drawing, and he also saw holes in the bottom of the strangest, almost like a flying rectangular wing. There's no other way to describe it. I also have seen videotape of a beam of light coming down on a small hill above deer feeders in a place called Brownwood. It's in the general region, but probably 44 miles away from Dublin and another 55 or 60 miles from Stephenville, but still in the general area. And in that video, not only do you see a beam of light in November, in December, a deer steps into the beam of light and disappears, and in January, what shows up, lasting for 6 hours, is the most vivid sphere of what appears to be a plasma that I've ever seen, as if it were focused around or studying the deer cameras.
This week we start out with Linda Moulton Howe in Glen Rose, Texas, near Stephenville, Texas, where that incredible sequence of UFO sightings took place a week ago. She has with her Steve Allen, the pilot who first observed this craft, a pilot of 30 years, who is going to tell us his own personal story of what he saw. Were these Air Force jets? Was it a secret weapon? Or was this genuinely something from somewhere else, where our Emmy Award-winning reporter is an Emmy Award winner for a reason? She's on the scene in cases like this, and she has got for us a blockbuster of a report. Then later, we're going to be talking to Don Schmitt. Don Schmitt is the leading expert on Roswell. He has some extraordinary new revelations, and the Air Force was doing the same thing back then that they are doing right now, saying, oh, it was just one of ours. Now, here she is from Texas, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. I have just spent the most extraordinary time here, arriving in the late evening of Tuesday, January 29th, and spending the 30th and the 31st seeing extraordinary videotapes, interviewing eyewitnesses, and going with Ricky Sorrells into those woods where he went deer hunting on New Year's Day, January 1st, and had an object fill the sky above him that from his machinist's point of view looked like a molded matte gray metal with a very strict and